The Institute is especially pleased to welcome Mayor Washington back as an alumnus of our program for newly elected members of Congress, which he attended in the fall of 1980 after his election to the United States House of Representatives from the 1st District of Illinois. Mayor Washington was born in Chicago in 1922 and was graduated from Roosevelt University and the Northwestern University School of Law. He served as a state representative and then a state senator in the Illinois legislature until his election to Congress, where he served with distinction on the House Education and Labor Committee, Government Operations Committee, and the Judiciary Committee. As a freshman congressman, he was a floor leader in the successful fight to extend the Voting Rights Act and was reelected in 1982 by the highest margin of any congressman in the country, 95%. This must be what the mayor means when he talks about a one-party city. Tonight, Mayor Washington will speak about new directions for the Democratic Party, and he has agreed to take questions from the audience when he completes his prepared remarks. Mayor Washington.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Charlie Trueheart, for a very wonderful introduction, and thank you for inviting me here. It's just a distinct honor for me to be a Harvard fellow, even for a day. I don't think I'd be disloyal to my law school at home or my university if I said I've often appreciated and admired the products that come out of Harvard, and I must confess on many occasions I have compared. Comparisons are usually odious, and they have been in that case. I've just been totally and completely enchanted with the product of the school in many, many ways. It's been a wonderful day. It's been a pleasant series of seminars in which you have probed me deeply. I hope you got something out of it. I certainly did. I must confess I was mildly intimidated when I started, but I sort of got into the swing of it. After all, it's been some time since I've devoted this much time and attention to a campus, but thank you for inviting me here. It's been a wonderful thing, and I think this fellowship concept this fellow concept is a wonderful, wonderful thing for students because it's an outreach. It brings the classroom and the theory back to practicality. It's the kind of thing that should be emulated all over this country. I've often been of the opinion that we spend too much time in the classrooms dealing with the concepts and don't try to apply them or get close to those people who do apply them, even in a happenstance way, and I think it's very useful to do that. So it's been a very entertaining evening and day for me, and I shall leave here with the fondest memories of this wonderful institution. I've been able to spend less time with you because, unfortunately, we had a lot of work in Chicago. The rumors of our tremendous movement and reversal of the process in Chicago are true. Rumors about some of the discombobulation and some of the trauma which exists in the minds of some of the old guard, it's all true. But this too shall pass away, and I assure you that very soon Chicago, in terms of the management of its city, will be brought yelling, kicking, and screaming into the 20th century to align itself with such great cities as Boston, etc., and so forth. I'm here tonight to try to shed some light on the changing political landscape of this country. Now, that's a tremendous task, and I hope we're up to it. I want to talk to you about some new directions that the Democratic Party must take in order to recapture the White House in November. I believe that my election in Chicago serves as an excellent example of what must happen nationally throughout the Democratic Party. But as I talk to you tonight about my perceptions concerning the radical right, and the circumstances surrounding my election, I feel compelled to put my thoughts into the proper context by ever so briefly discussing a major catalyst to political change. I'm talking about the influence of the media. Back home, I tenderly and respectfully refer to our working journalists as barracuda. I don't think they take it too harshly because it's not meant that way, and a person like myself wedded to the First Amendment in all of its parameters, freedom of press and freedom of speech, would have to appreciate the press. But I sometimes think that perhaps they concentrate too much on the freedom of the press aspect and forget that freedom of speech is more generic and encompassing and includes freedom of the press, But at any rate, I feel compelled to put my thoughts into the head and shoulders above any other political figure of our time. That is not necessarily bad, it's a question of how it's used. But star quality doesn't necessarily have anything to do with judgment and real leadership. When political issues are transcended by personal appeal, television government may become synonymous with demagoguery. Demagoguery is leadership which uses popular prejudices and false claims and promises in order to gain power. It's almost compulsory for modern politicians to manipulate popular prejudices and false claims in order to win television exposure and popular acceptance. The president's trip to China was an imperial trip, a media event so sure of itself that the actual destination was secondary to the ceremony of getting there. Neither the president nor the other television stars had much concern that while this media event was going on, the poor people of the Dominican Republic rioted in the streets over the doubling food prices. In China, the president didn't have to concede that CIA meddling in Central America was destroying our chances to deal with social change in ways other than direct military intervention. He didn't have to provide an answer to what we would do about the atomic bomb that Iran is developing at a devilish, feverish rate. Clearly, gestures instead of actions have come to occupy the center stage. The danger is that a nation which selects movie stars or anchormen as leaders may have a hard time surviving in a real world against a competitor of ideological enemies and economic rivals. The fact is that a weak president, a strong commentator system of government, has a dubious chance of success, and that disturbs me and hopefully disturbs everyone else. What does all this say about the future political landscape of this country? It says that it is not being shaped by reality. I am concerned about a trend in American politics which blurs the lines of distinction between style and substance. I am concerned about the upcoming presidential election because the public may not separate real political goals from the television picture and its shadow reality. I am concerned that the real problems confronting this great nation are being manipulated and that the media is buying into deflection and not reality. The direction of the Democratic Party must be to build an effective coalition that deals with this reality and whose goals will be to send President Reagan back to Hollywood, soundstage, where he can make war movies without endangering the world. The Democratic Party must create an effective new coalition which includes, among others, minorities, women, the poor, the outsiders, union members, industrial workers, small farmers, urban residents, ethnic Americans, and progressive white voters. Let us look at my election in Chicago as an example of this new coalition and how it has been being painstakingly put together, notwithstanding reverberations coming from Chicago which are contrary to what this development is. That I am the mayor of one of the largest and most complex cities in the United States testifies to my passion for coalition politics. Chicago is too diverse for a single issue candidate to get elected mayor. You need to be able to strike a diversity of chords. This means, for example, that racial politics has no future in Chicago because we must have a coalition of interests in order to win. The same holds true for the national party doubly. A critical threat to party unity and the establishment of this coalition is the growing influence of radical right wing with a dangerous intent called polarization. It is not conservatism per se. Many Middle European ethnic groups consider themselves conservative in a social and economic matters. They are, however, intrinsic parts of the traditional Democratic Party coalition. Other Americans who consider themselves to be Republican are conservative in the best sense of the word, which includes a traditional respect for the heritage of the past and a reasonable caution about overly innovative social experiments. My city includes hundreds of thousands of ethnic conservatives who place traditional values of home, church, and family at the top of their political shopping list. I have a great deal of respect for their contributions to the greatness of Chicago and to this nation. Most of those voters chose not to vote for me last year. But I'm working to attract their votes by answering their economic and neighborhood concerns. In short, by governing fairly, openly, and inclusively. And to that extent, the burden of proof is upon the person who puts himself forward as a leader. The irrationality which descends upon you may be just that, but you can't eschew it, you can't ignore it, you can't deny it, you have got to deal with it. I choose to deal with it in the manner and form and fashion which I am accustomed, which is to be fair, open with everyone, barring none and favoring none. In Chicago, the radical right comprises a group of people who have no political identity with conservative political thought. They have a dangerous intent which has no party label. That intent is to reverse the egalitarian thrust of our society, which we've witnessed for the past 50-plus years. An interesting phenomenon is the articulation of liberal leadership against the far right has fallen, especially to political leaders who not long ago were relegated to the outsider roles, especially minorities and women. It is somewhat ironic that we who have been put out find ourselves at this juncture in history perhaps the main and ever maybe lasting bastion to prevent the radical right horde from sweeping this country. Their success in dealing with the radical right means their survival in the political mainstream. Like the Democratic Party, the United States is a coalition of many different kinds of people. The issues which should unite us are economic opportunity and equality in social and political terms. The Civil War was fought over the question of slavery, the literal ownership by some of some by the few, and the moral, religious, and political ideals of equality for all peoples. Shadow battles of that war seem to be fought again and again in every generation. Many Americans feel that the radical right is riding again through the American dream. They are preparing to take a tough political stand against it. The national groundswell of black political participation is both an affirmation of ethnic political power and a defensive move against the right. It was President Reagan's cutbacks of social and economic programs that set the climate for Jesse Jackson's campaign. The Reagan strategists may have hoped that a progressive black electorate might frighten part of the white ethnic base away from the Democratic Party and force them to vote for a Republican or not to vote at all. The strategy is neither subtle nor new. It has been used since Reconstruction to prevent poor whites and poor blacks from working together towards common political goals. In the context of American history, it is a fair question to ask. If only the progressive black electorate is sophisticated enough to act as the glue which will hold together a fragmented party, does the party presently have the skillful leadership it needs to build a new coalition? To me, that is the $64 question. If our party leadership fails, black America would suffer first because the Reaganites have programs which are harmful to minority America. But the nation itself will feel the pain because poverty is a disease which has no racial propensity. It affects everybody close to it and spreads like an epidemic. Reagan has made one important contribution to the minority community. He taught it a great deal about the real nature of political power. Apathy has been replaced with fervor, and politics has become Americans' passion. The administration intuitively knows that minority registration and turnout is the single most serious threat to Reagan's reelection. That's why they made such a concerted effort to let the Federal Voting Rights Act run out without renewal. When that failed, they planned to make it unenforceable. While in the Congress, I was assigned the lead role by the Congressional Black Caucus, and I stood at the forefront of the battle to preserve the Federal Voting Rights Act. We fought to preserve it as our first line of defense against the radical right. We persevered despite awesome pressure and endless wealth. If we had failed, the political history of 1984 elections would be, I'm certain, vastly different. I might still have been elected the 42nd mayor of the city of Chicago, but Reverend Jackson would have had a significantly smaller Southern base as a presidential candidate. And I doubt if the November election would swing on the sides of the minority vote, which it well might, because Southern blacks would have been arrested in their move towards enfranchisement. Let us turn briefly to the Chicago experience for some lessons and ideas about the new directions for the Democratic Party. Retrospectively, black voters were not safe Democrats in this country until 1940, when 51% voted for Roosevelt. By 1952, 76% cast ballots against Eisenhower and for Stevens. But only 52% of the voters were Democrats on the local Chicago level. The change on the local level in Chicago came in 1955 when Richard J. Daley received en masse the black vote for his first mayoralty election. He won 76% of that vote and clearly won on the basis of that support, and it continued. In other words, Daley came into office and stayed in office because of black voters. By the 1970s, black voters discerned that their political loyalty was not being appreciated. The black population more than doubled from 1960 to 1970, but nothing could move the city schools toward desegregation. Daley fought to the federal courts to maintain racially discriminatory personnel policies for the fire and police department. Chicago's housing remained as the most segregated of any city in the United States. As a result, black voters began to attrit to stay away from elections by the hundreds of thousands. Daley began to rely more and more on the working-class white ethnic voters. Blacks became enemies of the machine, at first subtly and then openly. Proof came in 1979 when Jane Byrne won the primary election, a startling upset over Mayor Michael Bolandic, Daley's successor. Byrne's narrow primary victory was due to black voters who gave her 63% of the vote, and she won by the crushing figure of 12,000 total votes. Actually, even during the years when black voters were withdrawing their support of the machine by staying at home on election days, they stayed politically active by setting new agendas and testing new strategies. More than 10 years ago, progressive black leaders began to listen to the urgent pleas for reform from the middle class. They established themselves as independents who worked for reform of the regular party and the end of the machine. When I ran for mayor and lost 7 years ago, I didn't even get a majority of the black vote. 3 years later, however, when I ran for Congress as a reform candidate in the 1st Congressional District of Illinois, I was able to crush the machine nominee in a contest which was based on newly articulated political goals. When I was asked to run for mayor in 1982, I know that I might have a chance to win because political interests were everywhere. But if there was a movement, I had no objective way to measure its sincerity and strength. I decided to test it with a nearly impossible goal. I said, go and register 50,000 new voters in the next 3 months, and if you're successful, I'll consider being the candidate. 50,000 new voters were registered in just 30 days. In the next 3 months, nearly 250,000 new voters were registered, and a grand total of approximately 300,000 were registered by election day. We needed every vote because the Chicago election became a classic confrontation between a progressive reform Democrat and an ultra-conservative Republican who was supported by a rabid right wing and any number of defecting Democratic voters. We won with a successful coalition of progressive Democrats, black, white, Hispanic, Asian men and women. We won by forging a political coalition which had 3 major parts: a solid core, which was black, a successful alliance of Puerto Ricans, Mexican Americans, and progressive whites. Analytically, Chicago is no longer a predominantly white city, nor will it become a city which is predominantly black. Instead, it is in the unique position of being a city in which 3 groups will have roughly equal numbers within the next 13, 15 years. That is, blacks, Hispanics, and whites. At the present time, Chicago has about twice the number of Hispanics as Polish ethnics. The number of white ethnics has been decreasing at the rate of about 1.5% a year. But that attrition is slowing down, and we expect the white population to stabilize itself pretty soon if it hasn't done so already. No ethnic or racial group is expecting to represent a majority in Chicago any time in the foreseeable future. Thus, only coalition politics can lead to victory. Like the National Party, Democrats in Chicago must find common goals and common standards in order to win. But the question remains, can the Democratic Party form a new coalition to recapture the White House in November? The Democratic Party must avoid having the right divide Democrats so that a winning coalition cannot be formed in November. That ploy seeks to frighten white ethnics away by postulating hostility to black and Hispanic voters. It simply isn't true that that is the motive of anyone, but it is difficult to deal with. In order to win, Democrats must resist any attempts to drive a wedge between the different parts of the coalition. Party leadership must remain steadfast to our roots as the party of the economic have-nots and as the party of equality for all minorities and women. Coalitions are not easy to keep together. 4 years ago, organized labor confused substance with style and lost sight of the real political and economic interests. Many union members refused to vote or cast their ballots for Ronald Reagan, even though Reagan was opposed to organized labor, opposed to collective bargaining, opposed to minimum wages, opposed to strikes as a negotiating tool, opposed to management labor contracts, and opposed to the idea that good wages and labor ensure a healthy domestic economy. But realistically, who would have really expected Reagan to support labor, even after it helped put him into office? His political goals were 180 degrees opposite to those of labor. Reagan acted true to his politics. Union members who forgot what their interests were have paid for it time and again ever since his election. Working class voters who buy into the idea that minorities and women are usurping their political power should look at the real situation. Their economic interests are synonymous with those of the poor, not the rich. Working class voters have very little political power under Ronald Reagan. The trickle-down economic theories have created the worst economic condition for them in 50 years. They are being thrown out of the lower middle class into the poverty class. Their children don't have industrial jobs. They drive taxi cabs or work in fast food franchises for minimum wages with bleak futures and scant hope. Today, millions of working people have joined the ranks of the poor the right wing taught them to hate and fear. The federal deficit is more than $200 billion a year. Taxes have virtually disappeared for big corporations, but they have risen for the wage earner. Unemployment stands at least 9%. The cities fight bankruptcy because the federal government has turned away from their people and their needs. There is no safety net for the poor. Union busting has become a preoccupation of the corporations, and it is being upheld by the courts. The direction of the Democratic Party coalition must stress common economic issues and common social concern for equal treatment and fairness if it is going to be able to win. These themes are neither outdated nor impractical. I believe that they are at the heart of the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party faces a clear challenge in trying to get the media to focus on this new coalition and on reality. Fortunately for traditional Democratic political reformers like myself, I see the electorate beyond the evening news. In the images of a president cavorting in the ways voters can see the photographs of unemployment lines. In the television news stories of campaign toasts in Peking, voters can see the reality of the steel plant which has been shuttered, the little cottage which has been foreclosed. That's why the grassroots movement, which brought about a revolution in Chicago politics last year, is spreading nationwide, part of a continuum which started before it, part of a continuum which has swept up Reverend Jackson's campaign, and part of the continuum which will eventually increase the franchise on the part of the groups I've mentioned and hopefully replace the present incumbent in the White House. I'm actively involved in an effort to register an additional 3 million new black voters, and the party candidate, if he proves his commitment to the political goals of economic fairness and social equality, can expect as many as 12 million black votes in November. Don't worry yourself about defections in the black community. There will be a strong, solid, phalanx, anti-Reagan vote cast for the Democratic survivor. I predict that Chicago will give the party nominee a million-vote majority comprised of blacks, whites, Hispanics, and a powerful coalition which could rival the one created by Franklin Roosevelt, started back in 1932. If I am right, the Democratic Party can look forward to the White House for the next several elections, and the Republicans can begin to shed the radical right wing as the albatross it is in American democracy. Let me end there and simply conclude by saying that this analysis is based upon what I consider to be the only way that the Democratic Party can move toward electing a president, the only way that the Democratic Party can survive, and if they fail to do that speedily and do it with gusto and verve, then I think you're looking at the demise of the Democratic Party in the same sense that it's being ripped asunder in certain local locales like Chicago. It doesn't deserve to live unless it can reorganize and rejuvenate itself. The focus, of course, will be upon who the next Democratic nominee will be, and that's a logical focus. But the Democratic Party has another very serious problem, one which they refused to undertake about 3 years ago when Mr. Reagan was accepted. They brooded about that he was a popular communicator and therefore he should not be taken on. They obfuscated, they temporized, they put off, they delayed, and actually wound up, as Congress did, supine before the hobnail boot of a person who represented the radical right. The net result is that he gained an ascendancy and a momentum which he could never have gained had the leaders of the Democratic Party taken him on forthwith, point for point, program for program, and philosophy for philosophy. So we wasted 3 years. I think it should all come a cropper in the Democratic National Convention this year. I'm going to that convention, not just to nominate a president, which will happen, but going there also to try to help hammer out a real meaningful platform that will address itself to the heartfelt needs of all the constituent parts of that coalition which I have been discussing. And unless they do that, I think we simply cannot win that election. But I think it can be done because I think pressing at the door of opportunity, pressing at the voting booth all throughout this country is a burgeoning group of individuals who want open sesame because they feel that this country has gone in the wrong direction. They have opted to go into the Democratic Party because it represents either the lesser two evils or the best of all possible worlds, however you want to put it. But they're casting their lots there. And the challenge of the Democratic leadership, both nationally and locally, is to make certain that these individuals who have been disenchanted, who are felt shut out, or who have been by various chicaneries and mechanisms of the law kept out, they want entree. I think the future of this country depends upon the ability of the Democratic Party to open its doors and welcome them not with hosannas and handshakes, but with solid platforms, well carved out philosophy, programs designed to raise this country back into the 20th century, seed our cities, redevelop our infrastructure, do something about the depleting funds in the public school systems, do something about small business and all the other accoutrements, you might say, that are necessary to maintain this great country. It's a challenge that I hope that party can meet. If it doesn't meet it, it deserves to go the way of many other parties, sink into the earth, never to be seen again. Thank you.
As I said, Mayor Washington has agreed to take questions. There are microphones on either side of this floor and on the second floor. If you'd approach the microphones so that we can have the benefit of disseminating this program by radio and videotape, we'd appreciate it.
Mayor Washington, my name is Neville Reed. I'm a senior at the college. And I noticed when you described the coalition that you believe the Democratic Party must reassemble, you didn't include, at least as far as I recollect, you didn't include the Jewish constituency. And I'm just curious, in the history of the Democratic Party, history of the NAACP, history of the Civil Rights Movement, there's been a very strong link between, and even the history of the labor movement, very strong link between the Jewish progressive intellectual thought and progressive causes. There seems to now be a rift, and I want to address the question to you. First of all, do you think that rift is a problem? Do you view that as a problem? And if your answer to the first question is affirmative, what can be done to heal that rift?
Well, I didn't leave out the Jewish factor. I mentioned progressive whites, and I think that's the accolade I've always bestowed upon the broader Jewish community. It's a progressive community. The cornerstone of its culture, to me, is really, in essence, what the democratic system is all about: outreach, involvement, et cetera, and so forth. So in the phrase progressive whites, I was speaking of the broader Jewish community. The rift, so-called, which exists between the Jewish community and the black community is more apparent and real, in my opinion. I think it's been discussed and over-discussed very vigorously for the past 10, 11 years. It's been discussed almost to death. I have not detected, for example, the anti-Semitism in the black community, which many of my Jewish friends seem to think are there. It's just not there. That's not to say that all is peace and harmony, but there is no spirited anti-Jewish element within the black community that I'm conversing with, period. And so I think those fears are just groundless. On the other hand, there are some disagreements between the two groups, and those are strong disagreements which must be addressed very rapidly unless there is a drift between these two powerful people, both who have been victims historically and both who, based upon that historical victimization, should be the first and the forefront of fighting against the radical right and all such political trappings that people put upon themselves. We've both been long-standing sufferers. I'm not going to compare the suffering. That's not important. Suffice to say we've both been victims, and it follows as night does day that those should be the rallying points for any real serious ongoing revitalization of the coalition. But the problems must be addressed. For example, there is a contretemps over the question of affirmative action, spelled quota. The DeFunis case and the Baki case and certain prominent Jewish writers have taken strong positions against affirmative action, and some of them have equated affirmative action with quotas. I happen to have been one who was in the forefront of the fight back in the mid and late 40s on behalf of many of my Jewish friends who were the victims of quotas which kept them out of schools or limited their entrance into schools. In short, quotas were then used to deny them their entree into these schools, for example. The conception of a quota has changed, however. Now you find women and Hispanics and blacks knocking at the door of opportunity, and some see quotas as a step up in the direction of full involvement in the educational, economic, job market problems of this country. And so the question of the definition of quota has changed, and just like any other definition, it changed with historical time. One year something may be wrong, the next year it's all right. For example, when I was a little boy, if you called a black person black, you would probably wind up with a mouthful of knuckles. Now we are proud to say we are black people. The same holds true of colored or Afro-American. In other words, the overtones and undertones of a word or a title change with time, and so it is with quotas. And there are many black people and many women who feel that the quotas thing is a good progressive position for them to take. Many of the Jewish intellectuals and Jewish leaders are opposed to that. I think you've got to come to grips with that problem, not duck it, not dodge it, but deal with it, historically and otherwise, because unless it is done, then that's groundwork for laying the seed for future disunion. I don't want to brute that about too much either. I think what is required at this juncture in history is for black and Jewish people to carry on a spirited dialogue around all of these nuances and all of these perceptions and all of these latent fears which have cropped up over the last several years. I think that's the only way to do it. But they represent, when I say progressive white, I'm talking about, to a great extent, Jewish people. They represent, to me, one of the main phalanxes of a revitalized Democratic Party.
Let's have a quick follow-up question. Louis Farrakhan introduces Jesse Jackson at various rallies. He's been quoted as calling Adolf Hitler a great man, saying many things which, to those of us who do believe that the Jewish black rift is a problem, is embarrassing. Do you think that Jesse Jackson ought to publicly condemn the statements by Farrakhan that have alienated a lot of Jewish support?
Let Jesse Jackson take care of his own business. I will deal with the question. I'll take care of the question of Farrakhan. I think Mr. Farrakhan made a stupid remark, period. How can you possibly equate Hitler with anything great? in light of what he perpetrated upon this world. I mean, I think that was just a stupid remark on the part of Mr. Farrakhan. I shall tell him that when I see him. Insofar as his relationship with Reverend Jackson has to handle that matter himself.
Thank you.
All right. Mr. Mayor, Jesse Jackson has made a very big thing out of his opposition to double primaries, as he calls them, and of course, wants them eliminated. Some leaders, even in the black community, such as Andrew Young, probably don't agree with him, or don't entirely agree with him, feeling that it's a knife that cuts both ways. I wondered if we could have your position on that, whether they should be eliminated by runoffs or not.
I'm absolutely opposed to dual primaries. In 1981, in the Federal Congress, when I was, as I said before, fighting for the extension of the Voting Rights Act and made any number of tours in the South and hearings, et cetera, there is no question that the dual primary, as evidenced in many southern states, is simply used as an impediment to prevent one man, one vote concept, which eventuates in elected offices for black people in the South. There is no question about it. And it's just as flagrant as the grandfather clause and all such other impediments which have just died and been pushed aside along the way. I think the Democratic National Convention should deal with this issue. I would not put it upon the candidates necessarily, but I think the Democratic National Convention should deal with it. I think there should be a very clear statement of purpose as to what it's all about. Traditionally in this country, civil war or primary fights have been resolved by the plurality vote. As a matter of fact, I won a primary in Chicago through a plurality vote with 3 candidates, so I have a bias in that direction. But historically and rationally, I just don't think it's needed. And when obviously it's been designed to prevent the election of black people, I simply think it has to go, and the Democratic Party should deal with it. That, in a sense, is one of the things, although I didn't have that in mind, that I was talking about when I said that the Democratic Party has got to make some serious adjustments in order to sustain itself. And unless they can make that kind of an adjustment, which is minuscule, I just don't think there's any future for the Democratic Party. So I for one, will push that issue, not above all others, but will push that issue at the Democratic National Convention because I think it should be resolved.
Mayor Washington, given your assertion that black Americans will be solidly behind the Democratic Party in 1984, whoever the nominee is, what is to keep party leaders and party voters from preferring a candidate who is more moderate and will be able to capture moderate white voters, given that they will have this black base that will vote for the eventual nominee?
You're talking about the Democratic nominee?
Yes.
Well, in my opinion, any Democratic nominee that comes out of the convention will probably be a moderate. And I think that the weaning process has seen to that. That's not necessarily bad, but if he comes out with a mandate, from the Democratic convention to the effect that they must deal with certain issues, that's all right too. After all, this politics is not fun and game, it's not beanbag, it's serious business. And realistically, I suppose a candidate has to paint himself, not totally to appease all people, but not paint himself in such a way that he appears to be a total and complete extreme, or you will phalange off the coalition. You've got to deal with it. That may sound like a contradiction, but it isn't. I think the party should stand for things. I think the party should be the bellwether to keep the candidate along a certain track. But if the candidate is viewed as moderate, that may be good or may not. But obviously in these times, I just don't think you're going to get a candidate, shall we say, radical of a radical variety, whether I may like it or not.
Thank you.
Now, that wasn't meant in derogation of Mr. Hart or Mr. Mondale at all.
Mayor Washington, I agree with your assessment of the state of politics and the importance of the media. I think that that media appeal has perhaps outstripped the importance of party politics in terms of electability. But you've offered no solutions. How do you recognize the ascendance of the media and begin to approach accountability without impinging on the First Amendment?
Well, this very institution is going to address itself, and evidently is prepared to spend a heck of a lot of money to deal with that question. Maybe not solutions, but analysis over a long period of time. I would not necessarily want to await their determination, but suffice to say, it will help. This is an area where you have to be very cautious. You're talking about the First Amendment, and I am not advocating violation of the First Amendment at all. I'm not talking about passing laws or doing anything to impede it. I'm simply saying that maybe two things might be called for, just sort of an ad hoc answer to your question. One is some sort of self-restraint on the part of the media, but that's devoutly desired, but perhaps will never eventuate, competition being what it is. And as you know, I don't know about Boston, but in Chicago, the 6 o'clock news is the lowest point in television time. You get a lot of pep or a lot of simplicity or a lot of venom or ire, but you never get analysis at a point in time of the day that you think you would get it. It's just not there. The competition seeks its lowest common denominator. But self-discipline might help. Ultimately, the best way to have the press function in a responsible way is for the body politic to be very scrupulous about whom they patronize, to be very outspoken in terms of responding to what they consider to be incorrect. Far too long, we've had a passive clientele insofar as this country is concerned and the Fourth Estate is concerned. We've just been observers. And then when you get a politician like myself who says, well, I respect and have fought for and will continue to fight for the First Amendment, freedom of the press in terms of shield laws to protect you from subpoenas and things of that nature. And when you find a person like myself who has dedicated his life, public life, to defending the press, who says, I defend you, but when you're wrong, I'm going to speak out, no matter what happens. I think politicians should get some backbone and really talk to the press and criticize the press. For example, over the last several days, I have been analyzed, reanalyzed, sifted, weighed, polled, and all that sort of stuff, and given grades from D to A, triple A. I gave myself the triple A. by all the media. In a sense of fairness and balance, don't you think I have a right to grade the press? You know what I mean? In other words, I think we should take on the press in a spirit of competition and fairness and speak out and talk back to them. Not erode the First Amendment, I'm not talking about that, but don't be passive people in a world in which you know you're being manipulated, subliminally and otherwise. You know yourself, you pick up a paper and 5 out of 10 headlines make no sense at all. For example, I went down to Wilberforce University to do a commencement several days ago and made a speech about the radical right and gave Reagan holy hell, not a temperate speech like I gave today. And before I could get home, the headline at home says, Mayor attacks Reagan, quote, radical right, comma, end of quote, racism. I hadn't said a thing about racism. But that was it. It was so bad that in the second edition they took it off. But those things happen, and one should not accept that. It's not fair. Nobody has the right to be wrong, not even under the guise of the First Amendment. So what do I suggest? Body politic that reads the press critically or listens or views it critically, and more self-discipline within the ranks of the Fourth Estate.
Mayor of Washington, while you advocate several noble social programs, you haven't really talked about how you're going to fund these. And Reagan's tax proposals or tax cuts have really been popular even among the lower middle class. And I was wondering how you could propose to fund these programs that you advocate without alienating even lower class voters.
Well, I don't know how they could be popular among middle class voters because it's in one pocket and out the other. There's been no savings. Anybody making less than, I think, $65,000, $70,000 has realized no significant tax savings at all under Mr. Reagan's 1981 tax program. It's just not true. We're just giving away tons of money. We need a whole tax revision of our tax structure, dealing with foreign investment tax credits and all that sorts of things. That's one source, a readjustment of the tax base and all that. Secondly, the defense budget, in quotes defense, to me it's a war budget. The defense budget needs to be pared down drastically. We can't afford it. We can't Obviously, we can't repeat what Mr. Johnson went through, guns and butter. We have to make a better choice. We need more conventional weapons. I think that's generally admitted. We have to stop this mad race to get highly sophisticated weapons, many of them that don't even work, and just stop blowing money after money into a cesspool trying to outstrip the Russia in this atomic war. I mean, we're mad beyond gone mad. So the dollars are there. And a redistribution of some of those 230 some odd billions of defense dollars this year to the tune of maybe 50 billion, in my opinion, would do a lot to get this country back on its feet. We've got a lot of work to do. Our housing stock is debilitating. Our infrastructure is just crumbling under our feet. We can restructure this country, give it a tremendous stimulus through selective governmental progressive spending, not handouts, not welfare, but investments in real things like education, small business, development of the cities, and so forth. The money is there. It's a question of prioritizing and readjusting it. But if we're going to be led by the nose by a president who can't resolve the domestic problems but wants to jump on a banana republic to get your attention off the business, and if you fall for that, we'll just be forever. We'll be forever paying for something we don't need and can't use, but may well run the danger of building up our expectations so much that we just start another war.
Just a short addendum. Would you be in favor of Social Security paring down or some sort of cuts because of our population is aging, and that is an increasing portion of our budget? I was wondering if you're in favor of that, and that money isn't going to the poor necessarily as much as the middle class and upper middle class.
No, I'm not for paring down significantly the Social Security benefits. I think they should be leveled, maybe an occasional snip here or two, but nothing serious. I think we have to change the whole definition of work and leisure. Let's face up to it. We're into an automated world. There may not be enough jobs to go around. So why don't we just shuffle and readjust our conception of work and time and all that sort of thing, and be more productive. But I think we should continue to shelter the aged. I mean, I see no harm in that.
Thank you.
Getting back in a way to something somebody was asking about earlier, it seems to me that it's pretty likely that Mondale will be the nominee of the Democratic Party. It's also my feeling that he is not very attractive as a candidate who would represent the coalition that you're talking about. And if he does lose, it may well be for that reason. In the light of that, could you be more specific about what kinds of commitments you would like to see forthcoming from Mondale in the direction of being more representative of this new coalition, and how is he going to be bound to those commitments? What I fear is Mondale may somehow squeak by, get elected, and set the stage for another Reagan or somebody even worse than Reagan, because he will represent, it will be just more of the same, more disillusionment, more disgust with along the lines of what happened after 4 years of Carter.
Well, I don't think one should put all one's eggs in one basket. Elect a president, walk away, and assume that things are going to happen, even if you have a first-rate platform, which will be the first in this country. I think you have to follow up. When I talk about new directions, I'm talking about involvement. I'm not just talking about electoral politics. I'm talking about pressure politics. I'm talking about organizing, grassroots organizing, and keeping ongoing pressure upon elected officials on all levels, but in this case, the federal. I think massive pressure has to be exercised against congressmen and the president. I think the president, whoever he is, should be forced to reflect the desires of his constituency, whether it's in the platform or not. There is no blueprint. There's never a blueprint for work. You just have to make a commitment to it. What I see happening in this country is a growing interest of tremendous proportions, almost avalanche proportions. I think you're going to see a new kind of person, or some people change to be more aggressive in the whole area of pressure politics. We know what the tools are. They've been honed and refined. People know how to use them. They just don't do it. You have too much faith in public officials, and you assume that if you elect somebody, that's going to be the answer. It's not going to be the answer. Even the best politicians like myself have to be prodded and pushed and cajoled and enticed and made knowledgeable of the fact that people are holding you accountable. I don't want to give you a glib, easy answer. I'm simply saying the election is not enough, but we've got to make that kind of push, and the push can only come from those people who make up the party or would make up the party.
Can you maybe just mention a few specifics that you'd be looking for?
From
say,
Mondale?
From Mondale.
I'd rather not. Don't paint Mr. Mondale as an ogre. He's had a long and distinguished career. Perhaps not as outspokenly progressive as I would like, but the career is there to be analyzed. He may be playing it a bit cautious, and you can understand that, although I don't agree with it. I hope he doesn't slip into a Me Tooism attitude, but I think he's a little too much concerned about the radical right, and perhaps should take it on more. But if he doesn't, I still wouldn't cross him off. I still think that what's needed is a strengthening of the party from the grassroots, new congressmen, stronger congressmen, stronger platforms, and all those things.
My name is Robert Conway. I'm a fellow at the Center for International Affairs. I'd just like to talk a bit more about your grades, if you wouldn't mind. The specific question is, what should we learn from your success in Chicago? In fact, the fact that you won there. You've made the analogy between your victory in Chicago and what you'd like, in fact, to happen at the national election. So could you tell us what you did, in fact, that was right and what was wrong? And what advice would you give to Jackson at this stage? Is he, in your view, doing the right thing, or would you prefer that he handle his campaign somewhat differently?
Well, first of all, it's not a similar situation. Let's face it, I don't think anybody in this room expects Reverend Jackson to be nominated by the Democratic National Convention. I mean, that's just not in the cards. Reverend Jackson's, I don't know what his goal is, but obviously the value is that he's been a catalyst to help push and pull people out of the doldrums, part of that continuum I spoke of. He's playing a dual role, stimulating people to become involved and also trying to articulate the issues a little clearer. That's his role. What he does in the convention is really incidental. If he does nothing else, he's performed that, period. So there's no similarity between what happened there and what happened in Chicago a year ago. What happened in Chicago a year ago was not a strange phenomenon. It's happened in other cities throughout the country. It's happened in quite a few. You might follow me nostalgically as we look at Gary and Cleveland and Detroit, Newark, Atlanta, and Birmingham, and New Orleans, and Chicago, and Philadelphia. The same phenomena happened. What was it? You found a group of people who had been wedded to a party, slavishly so, pulled away from it because it wasn't functioning, retrenched, came back, and started fighting within primary elections to, after a period of time, place one of their own in office because they had not been able to get the kind of reaction from others. That's not an unusual phenomenon. That's what happened in Chicago. The lesson to be learned is that you have got to take care of people's needs if you expect them to pay allegiance to a party or to anything else. That's the lesson for the Democratic Party. Nationally, you draw it from local experiences. How can that be transmitted? In the way I've been trying to say this evening. The Democratic Party nationally, insofar as you can call it a party nationally, but it's really a federation. The Democratic Party nationally must address itself to the basic needs of that coalitional aspects which we talked about. They must do that. Let's talk about economic opportunity and all those sorts of things and spell it out in cold relief so that people can see it in order to sustain itself. If it doesn't do it, it's going to lose in the race. That's really the lesson. There's no more to it than that. It's not an oversimplified version. It's very simple.
Could I press you on the point just quickly, because you've made the point that one should be appealing to the broad mass of people in this rainbow coalition. Is the press correct when it's saying that, in fact, that the Jackson phenomenon at the moment and tactic is, in fact, even though he speaks that way, what is actually happening is the opposite, that, in fact, he's just relying on a very particular constituency, the black vote, and he's, in fact, not trying to broaden the base?
I was addressing my remarks to a black candidate running on the national ticket. I was addressing my remarks to how a Democratic nominee should comport himself in trying to bring a coalition together and hold it. You're talking about Reverend Jackson running as a black man trying to attract different votes. That's a different proposition than what I'm talking about. He is similar to the situation I had in Chicago, except that his base of support is much, much smaller, and therefore, logically, based on what's happening, there's simply no way for him to win. That's not true in Chicago. That's not true in those cities I mentioned, and that's the very great difference there. Now, if your question goes to how Reverend Jackson should campaign nationally to win, that's another question. We may have 4 years to deal with that one.
Mayor Washington, my question follows up on the tax question we just had. How important do you think the role of the state should be in the industrial development of this country? And what do you think the Democratic Party should advocate during its campaign on that issue? And connected to that, do you think that the opinion of the new coalition, of the groups that are part of the new coalition, is homogeneous on this subject? And don't you think there's a broad range of opinion on this industrial policy subject?
When you say state, are you talking to the United States as a body politic?
The government, I mean.
The government. What should be the role in industrial development? Oh, it should be, I think, a catalyst, prime pumps, in a very sustained and effective fashion. I spoke of infrastructures. I think that's a fertile source that the government should be addressing itself to for several reasons. One, private industry is not going to do it. That is a governmental function. It should be about the business of inventorying and restructuring our infrastructure. I'm head of the subcommittee on the Coalition of Mayors, that's not the name, U.S. Conference of Mayors, on infrastructure. We've been dealing with it quite heavily. It's got to be done. The whole country is just going to sink into the earth unless we start doing something about our sewers and our roads and our bridges, et cetera, et cetera. That money can only come from governmental units. The local units can't deal with it. It costs too much, particularly the cities in the Midwest, Northeast. So there's got to be some federal largesse coming there. That's an investment, really, in the country. I've suggested two other ways, things that can be done. We can stimulate our housing development as a pump primer by adjusting mortgage rates and mortgage supplements, for example, so that people can rebuild and start building these houses, rehabbing these houses, because the stock is low. Sources of the money, I don't think it's oversimplistic to point to the defense budget, to point to a readjusted tax structure for those dollars. So I think that the federal government has a primary role to play in trying to reindustrialize this country. If it starts, it reverberates, it triggers, it links, it matches private investment, and that's what it's all about.
Mayor Washington, I hate to have you come all the way here and get away without giving us some of your opinions on Edward Verdoliak. I have, as a non-Chicagoan, I'm sort of interested in the local scene. There are two questions. One is, how long is this mortal combat with you and Mr. Verdoliak going to last?
Mortal?
And it seems that mortal, not moral, but it seems. And the other question is, just your comments generally on the machine or the remnants of the machine. How has it evolved since Daley's death? And is Verdoliak just trying to be a carbon copy of what Daley was when he was alive?
Well, I'd rather not focus on Mr. Verdoliak as such, except to say that he represents an old system, an old guard that doesn't want to let go, and so that's what the political fight is all about, only that and nothing more. How long will it go? Oh, it won't go much longer. He's in the death throes now. And I think through a combination of just dedication and singularity of purpose on my part, through mammoth pressure from legitimate business interests and neighborhood groups and our wonderful press back home, I think he'll pretty soon get the point that his days are just numbered. I hope no one gets the impression that I have any what standards and who shall run the city and under what guise. It's no more to it than that. I forgot part of your last question. Well, the machine was actually, it's been dying a long time. I touched on it in giving my analysis because people were pulling back from it because it simply was not producing for a substantial number of people in the machine. Then, like I said before, the goodies that it had to dole out were too costly, too expensive. People are just totally disenchanted with it. We can't afford to continue to hire people for which there is no work. We can't afford to continue to have no bid contracts in which the city is just ripped asunder with exorbitant prices and high cost overruns and all those sorts of things. We can't afford to continue to pay under the cover for things that should be done by virtue of being a taxpayer and the business people. It drives business away. It frightens them. It intimidates them. It makes them angry. We can't afford to give sloppy city services to business people and others who need to use the public thoroughfares to get their markets to and from work. All of these things which comes from mismanagement, greed, and slovenliness, these things just have to go. So the machine has been gradually treading over a period of years. Certain elections accelerated the process. The courts have come in and legally just dismantled the patronage system. So the thing just came apart in Chicago. It's come apart in other cities through a similar development. And it's Chicago's turn. So it's just about dead. Patronage as such never thoroughly dies out. It's a relative matter, of course, but Chicago has just been the epitome of an ancient form of government which harbors patronage. So it's just about gone. Every time I say that, somebody accuses me of being a patronage wielder, but that's not true. We have certain areas of discretionary jobs which we call executive discretion, which is distinguished from patronage as such. But I think you're seeing the declining days of the old patronage machine in the city of Chicago. And it's going whether we wanted it to or not. It's just its time has come, period. There are many politicians, local politicians in Chicago, who just don't understand that you can't do business like you used to do it, and they're just in a state of trauma. They can't function. You know, they're so used to being led around by the nose and being patted on the head and giving some crumbs and cookies that they just don't understand that that day is gone, and people expect more. One reason why the credibility of politicians in Chicago, and I'm not talking about all of them obviously, is low is because people see them as caricatures of real leaders, and they're just disgusted with them. Mike Royko has gotten famous talking about Chicago aldermen with his wit and genius for contradictions.
As a former campaign worker of yours, I'm still waiting for my job.
You work for me?
Right.
Thank you. Vote early and vote often. You know.
Right. But I have a question, another question about Chicago politics. I'm wondering if there are any plans now to run an independent, third-party, quote-unquote, reform slate for the county offices in the fall.
I don't really know. It's been discussed by several local leaders that they were thinking about running a third party on the county level, I assume. Whether that eventuated or not, I don't know. I think what has happened is that there's some confusion between a third party and running independent candidates for particular offices, some of them the county offices. I think those two things have been confused. Whether that will get off the ground, I don't know. I have not advocated any such thing, although there are those who would like to accuse me of, harboring this thing. So that I don't know what the answer will be. We'll know very shortly because there's a time span in which they must be formed. But I think what has happened is, if I may repeat myself, is some people have confused running independent candidates, which is being advocated by quite a few people, as over against running for a third party, which is technically very difficult, and I'm not certain that that's what they really mean.
Well, do you advocate running any independent candidates, particular for state's attorney, and do you plan on endorsing State's Attorney Daley?
I haven't advocated running anything, and I have not endorsed anybody on the county ticket as of yet, and I don't know what I will do on the county ticket. And so far as the Democratic presidential candidate, I'll vote for the Democrat. I don't care who it is. I shall also vote for Paul Simon for United States Senator, and further fine saith not.
But just one point on that. Don't you think you run the risk there of alienating the Northwest and Southwest side ethnic Democrats, which you admitted, you got very few votes from in the general election? And isn't it important to reach out for them? And wouldn't one way of reaching out to them be having some sort of alliance with Richard Daley? I know you've tried to do that, and he's sort of stayed away from you. And I'm just sort of wondering, in the future, do you think there's a possibility that you two will work together? Or do you think, and if Daley has to run without your support, we have the risk of those ethnic urban Catholics on the Northwest and Southwest side going over to the Republican Party under a very popular and energetic candidate, former Police Superintendent Rezac for State's Attorney. And are you aware of the risk of sort of losing them to the Democratic Party? What I'm wondering about.
Losing
the people on the Northwest, Southwest sides, the people who tend to, or at least on the Southwest side, have been in the past anyway supporters of Richard Daley, and who we would think that former Superintendent Rezac would be popular there. Well, I'm just wondering, that tying into the whole national question, what is the future of those ethnic Democrats in the national or in the Democratic Party?
Well, I spoke of a coalition in which, and I made it very clear I was talking about ethnic white America being part of that coalition, and I think I made it very clear that I did not equate that element with the radical right, but with a conservative, solidly conservative propensity, and I have no quarrel with that, although I'm not a conservative. On the other hand, politics is politics. It's business. Nobody does anything for anybody for nothing. Now, unfortunately, Mr. Daley and I have not been able to work out our problem between us, so I would hope that we could. I don't give it up. He made a choice, and the choice was not in my favor, and it created some political problems for me. So I just prefer to leave it there. The door is open. If he wants to come on home and work out something with his mayor in a fashion which he was accustomed to by virtue of being named Daley, if he wants to make that concession, I assure him he'll have a long, happy life as State's Attorney in Cook County. If he doesn't do it, I'm not going to visit the thunder of Thor on his head, but I would be very unhappy.
Last question.
Okay. Historically, the Democratic Party in the South has been the party of George Wallace and of Lester Maddox. And recently, the Democratic Party, a lot of Southern Democrats like Phil Gramm, have sided with Reagan and voted for key Reagan measures in Congress. And I was just wondering, what, if anything, the Democratic Party should do to keep Southern Democrats in the fold? Or do you think the Democratic Party should just realign as a progressive party and ignore the South or ignore Southern conservative Democrats?
No, I don't think it should ignore it. I think if you track Reverend Jackson to the South, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and some other states, I think you'll find that he carried many of those congressional districts held by the so-called boll weevils. I think his figure was 11 or 12. I don't know what's the accurate figure, but it was quite a few. What has happened in many of those congressional districts is that black registration has increased to the point that with an incremental white vote, they were able to push Jackson over the top. Well, those same voters are there, and those same voters might well put up other candidates, liberal or black, who will take on the boll weevils and just remove that problem. In I forgot the number of the Congress, in 1981, when I was in Congress, the difference of the boll weevils made the difference in the budget that Reagan got passed. I've forgotten the exact figures, but I think it was something like 8 or 9 vote spread or something like that, which made the difference. Had those boll weevils not been there, or had they voted for the Democratic alternatives, Mr. Reagan wouldn't have gotten that horrible budget passed. So the thrust there, presumably, will be to get a different striped congressman in those particular areas. Now, I don't cross off the South. Everybody from the South is not a raving boll weevil by any stretch of the imagination, but there are many Southern Democrats who are boll weevils who will vote with the Republicans and who don't feel any allegiance to the Democratic Party and don't vote for the major issues put forth by the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. But I think what has happened is Mr. Jackson has pulled a sheet off of them, so to speak. And bad analogy, that example. And I think what might well happen is that many of them will be defeated by virtue of the fact that people now know they can be taken by the new votes which have entered into the Democratic circle. Well, thank you very much.